everyone, and welcome to this episode of Coffee Break and Parenting Talk. I am Mia Clarice, and I'm extra excited today to be speaking with an old friend, a very dear friend, and someone who has so much wisdom, and I've learned so much from her. So today I'm speaking with Katzo Kangwana. She's a licensed clinical social worker specializing in the treatment of trauma and eating disorders. When she's not working with clients, she facilitates workshops on spiritual development. Katzo has an MA in clinical mental health counseling from Union University and an MSW from UConn. Katzo's first career was in wildlife conservation, and she holds a BA in zoology from the University of Oxford and a PhD from the University of Cambridge. Katzo's life has spanned 4 continents, and her broad experience informs her work with clients of all backgrounds. Welcome, Katzo. It is so good to have you today.
Thank you so much, Mia. It's such an honor to be here and so wonderful to be reunited in a way with you.
Yeah. So I was so delighted a few months ago when I saw that you have a book. You published a book called Noble Soul. And that was so exciting because I have not seen you for so many years. And just reading this book reminded me of just the wonderful conversations that we used to have. So to let everybody know, I met Katzo in Abu Dhabi when we lived in Abu Dhabi about, I think now like 16 years ago.
Mhm.
I have to remember how old my son is because that's when we met you.
Yeah.
And yeah, we were, I think I always think of you as someone who really encouraged me with my parenting journey. So I am so glad to, be able to talk with you again and, discuss some of the things in your book and also your experiences with your work.
Well, thank you so much for having me.
Yeah.
I'm excited.
So it says that you've lived like in 4 different continents. Can you tell us a little bit about where have you lived?
So I was born and raised in Kenya, and then I went to university in the United Kingdom, and I did undergrad and graduate studies there. I got my PhD there, and then I went back to Kenya, lived there, and then I met my husband in Nairobi, and he was completing his training in the United States. So we moved to the United States and we lived there for about 6 years. And then we went to Dubai for 2 years and lived there. And then we lived in Abu Dhabi for another 4 years. And then we moved back to the States. So that's sort of the journey. And I've been
Wow.
here, I think, for the last 13 years or so now.
Right. That's amazing. A lot of people, being an expat, you always meet people who lived in many different places. And yeah, I feel like it's not just the places that you lived in that are very diverse, but also your education. I mean, going from zoology into therapy, just what an interesting combination.
So, I mean, there is some logic to that shift. I studied zoology, and then I had the opportunity of working for a PhD on elephant conservation. So I was out living in a tent for a couple of years on the foothills of Mount Kilimanjaro at the south of Kenya, and and then I got a job in a non-governmental organization working with wildlife conservation. And so as I started working there, but first in project development and then project management, I was I was intrigued as to what the root causes were of the conservation crises that we were
Mm.
noticing. And at the time it was in the 90s. Um, I think there was a lot of press around crisis in the decline with elephant populations
Mm.
and conversations around banning the sale of ivory to save elephants. And so thinking through all of the things that I was witnessing, I realized that the root cause of some of these problems that we were trying to mitigate as conservationists really lay in the motivation and behavior of people. That there were people willing to buy ivory without thinking of the consequences of their actions. And there were people that were motivated by financial gain to have poaching units go in, kill the elephants, and
Mm.
get the ivory. And so it became apparent to myself in my own journey that it was very important for me to actually be working at the root cause,
Mhm.
So I actually start to think myself even now as the root cause excavator because I want to know like what is driving this. And so as I was thinking about what are the root causes, I met my husband, I had children, and started to think about like my children have such different opportunities from other children. I was here in I write about this in the book,
Yeah.
that giving my children bubble baths in New Hampshire in the United States, and I had just been picking up children in my car in the field who were trying to get water, and we put their water cans in the back,
Right.
and we'd be walking miles to get water. So it was just this big disconnect in the world that kind of also had me thinking a little bit about what can we do here. And so that led me to starting to think about what I was doing as a mother.
Mhm.
Really shaping the thoughts, the behavior of children from a young age. I felt was a critical piece of what it is that I was seeing in the conservation crises that I had been working with before. And
Mm.
so I was like, okay, something here about what people are thinking, they are, what they're sensing is important for all of the crises humanity is facing, then I want to work there. So that's how I narrowed down to, mental health and what's going on with people and psychology. And then as my
Mm.
children grew, I started to go to school as they were going to school and retrained to be a mental health therapist. So that's a long answer to your question.
No, it's amazing because now that you say that, it kind of reminds me of the conversations we used to have when my son was little. And I
Mhm,
remember you making that point and talking because I was also interested. My studies was in international relations and political
mhm,
science, and I was passionate about peace. And my thinking was like, well, how do we raise children to
mhm,
have that desire to not want to engage in conflicts, to want to do something better for the world? And I remember you mentioning, saying things about like, what do we expose our children to? Like, even their clothes or the music that they listen to. And I was like, oh, that is interesting. We have a lot of power as parents,
mhm.
and the choices that we make really does influence our children, whatever beliefs they take on. So, yeah, that's really interesting. Um, I wanted to ask you because yeah, I mean, this book is really geared toward women, right? To Noble Soul, a guide to spiritual growth for women. And you
Mhm,
say that you wrote it because you worked with a lot of women, right?
mhm,
A lot of that just happened, who you
mhm,
worked with. I'm kind of like interested, for someone who's listening, what really inspired you to write this book specifically? Because I don't think I've read any book like this. I think
mhm,
it's one of it's a really needed. As a woman, I felt like, oh, for the first time, I feel like I'm really understood and like someone is really understanding my struggles. So thank you for writing it. But it's yeah, I'm just curious. What
mhm.
have you seen in your work that inspired you to write it, or what was the journey like?
Mhm. Thank you so much for saying that. Like, really warms my heart, because that was the goal, really, to communicate from a woman's perspective about the challenges of being women. So, I work as a licensed clinical social worker, and I specialize in the treatment of trauma and eating disorders, and those some more often than not go hand in hand. And so that has been my work for the last 10 years or so. And so um, in that work, supporting women to overcome this tenacious disease, eating disorders are very tenacious mental health disorders, um, started to notice that after we'd worked through some symptom relief and people were starting to get better, the women I work with, that they would start to ask existential questions,
Mm,
and I've heard them as existential questions. I don't think people always think that they're existential questions, but they've started to ask things like, well, what am I here for? What is my purpose? Who am I? um, as we tackle the idea that, your value doesn't come within the context of eating disorders, that your value doesn't come from how you look or the size of your clothes, it comes from something much deeper. I was like,
mm,
well, what is that? And
mm,
so I found myself actually having to create interventions to address those questions. And then I would use them with a few clients and they would be useful. And I feel like, oh, I can just do this, more regularly. And then thought that it would be really helpful to have something that people could take away from my office that would support them in that journey of asking these deeper questions. And in the time that I've been working that way and thinking that way, we've also had a lot of data coming out that's very clear on the connections between mental health and spirituality. And
Mm.
so confirming what I was observing in my work, and also now offering a scientific framework to understand what it is that I was observing. So the inspiration to write the book was really the struggle of my clients and their resilience and courage as they moved through and did really, really wonderful work to learn to connect with themselves deeper and to heal from the things that were ailing them.
Mm. Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, I think that kind of work really gives you perspective on
Yeah.
um that first of all, like these things are not just, like a lot of times when we deal with issues, we feel like it's just me. I'm all alone. I'm the only person who's dealing with eating disorders or, mental health problems or kind of struggles or depressions or things like this. And then you see that it's actually, um, there's so many people dealing with similar things.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm
And I
now that you were talking, I'm just like curious, do you have any ideas of like where does that come from, that struggle? Where does the disconnect come from for women? Why do we feel um why do we struggle with these issues? I'm just asking these questions right now because I find it really interesting. Like um
So, I mean, one of the things that I offer in the book, there was the experience as a therapist of the journeys that my clients are taking, and I showcase a few to just highlight what it is that
yeah.
the concepts that we were going through, or learning. Um, but I also offer in the book my own journey, and it's interesting because that wasn't there in the original script. That was something that my editor really pushed me to
Oh,
do. It was
I'm so
so
glad I'm so
uncomfortable.
glad your editor did because
I
that's like
know.
that's a very interesting part of the book.
But after we pulled that in and she was happy and I was happy, I realized that, this book is also the book that I wish I had had as a young woman,
Mm,
because it would have made my journey a little more efficient. I
yeah.
wouldn't have had to make all the stops and all the struggles along the way if I had had some guidance. So, in a way, the book is an offering um, from that perspective. I too, as a young woman, and I'm, using my own story to answer your question, didn't really have a sense of my true identity
Mm,
and didn't really have a sense of my value. And that I think came out of growing up in a culture where it's pretty clear, I think, to me as a child very early on that being born as a girl was a handicap. It was just, yeah, you were okay, but sons are better is the kind of environment that I grew up in, and I think that is a reflection of the broader experience of the feminine over centuries. Is that
mm,
there are very few cultures that really value the feminine over time, and so we've all been born into essentially a patriarchal system that has males valued above females and structures in place that will just keep that power structure
mm,
um, going. And so just being born into an environment where you're not valued because of who you are, I think becomes the beginning of sort of feeling something is off for a long time. And then that becomes, I feel like my own journey and the journey that I support with the women is coming back to the idea that actually your value is inherent and nobody can take that away from you, right?
right.
And that you are of equal value even while living in a world that doesn't quite reflect that yet, right?
Mm,
So I think that um, the core of the struggle of the feminine is that the patriarchy doesn't work for us, and I write a little bit about that in the book.
Yeah, yeah. There's so many nuggets in this book so far. I haven't finished reading it. I'm like three-fourths into it, and I think most of it is like highlighted. I'm like, yes, yes, yes. Growing up in Middle Eastern culture for me, I resonate with a lot of that stuff.
Mhm,
But I
mhm.
know that even in the Western cultures, we have not gotten into a place where we feel that there's actually true equality. It's still
Yes.
more like you being more like the male
Mhm.
as opposed to
Yes,
really
yes.
embracing that
Yeah.
feminine energy,
Mhm,
that feminine
mhm,
power that we
mhm.
have,
Yeah, yeah,
which is
yeah.
I think is kind of like the struggle of raising girls right now.
Mhm, mhm,
Yeah. I was
mhm,
yeah, that would be like my next questions. You talk in your book about the importance of cultivating identity and value, like to
mhm.
help maybe teenagers dealing
Yeah,
with peer pressures. I know
yeah.
there's a story in there about a girl who was struggling with her image and
Mhm,
how that she was affected. And I think we see that today, like with
mhm,
social media. That is probably one of the um, you know, a lot of parents are concerned about how social media influences, especially
mhm,
girls'
mhm,
image of themselves. And you talk about the importance of cultivating that inner identity and value.
mhm.
So how do we do that? Like how do we cultivate that, raising girls right now? How do we cultivate that identity? How do we um yeah, I'm interested to hear your thoughts.
There are a few things that jump come to mind, and when I work with young women, I have clients sometimes as young as 12, but
Wow.
then I also work with a full lifespan, so I have clients in their 70s. Um, and the majority of my clients are sort of in that 20s to 35 um, group. And the reason I'm saying that is that, when I meet the 12-year-old or the 15-year-old who has an eating disorder, and we sort of look at, well, do you have a sense of when this happened or how this happened? Some of the answers that I get, and this a little is reflected a little in the book, is like, well, when I was in elementary school, the boys called me fat, and then or I just realized that nobody wanted to be with me because I was bigger, and then that becomes the trauma that kind of holds that seeking of value and validation in place that might become the eating disorder. Now, I mean, eating disorders are, there are so many different aspects that feed into it. So we can't say, okay, that's the single cause. We also live in an environment where it's very clear that, smaller bodies are valued more, So there are many different factors that contribute to the emergence of an eating disorder. But one of the things that I think about when I meet young women that have gotten unfortunately ill, and are just doing amazing jobs with their recovery is that, what could we have put in place that would have been a little more protective of these young
Mhm.
women early on?
Yeah.
And so, sort of it's kind of like back engineering. If, if someone is, 12, 15, thinking that, how they look is really important, how much they weigh is really important, size of their clothes are really important. What is it that we could put in place that would prevent us from going there? Right. And so, one of those pieces I think that's important is to speak to the inner value of that individual from an
Mm.
early age, right? And and the languaging around that has to be, I think, or at least can begin with recognizing the attributes of that being, that
Mm.
soul, I call them. But you can use any any language. You could call it essence, spirit. So, when we say my hand, what what is the entity that the hand belongs to, right? So that indescribable part of every human being is what I'm addressing in terms of saying we want to talk about the qualities and the attributes of that part of us, right?
Mm.
And we know from all spiritual traditions that um, that indescribable core essence of a human being has qualities such as love, such as kindness, generosity, integrity, right? So to think of those as the qualities of that inner being, right? to reinforce and recognize that in each person, in our children, right? By
Mm.
using that language. And the Virtues Project has done a remarkable job, and it's an amazing contribution to actually giving us that vocabulary and understanding of that. So that's a resource that I highly recommend, thevirtuesproject.com. And so, realizing also that the way that we'll bring out this sense of inner being and these qualities in our children is by naming those qualities in them, right?
Mm.
So, when your child does something that's kind, like, oh, that was a really kind thing to do. Oh, I recognize that you're really helpful. That's a much richer way of interacting than, oh, good boy, nice, right?
Yeah.
Which people do, and it's encouraging and loving, but you can go deeper because when you call the attribute, when you say that was generous, that was kind, that was helpful, that was determined, that was courageous, you kind of awaken those qualities of that inner essence, right? So
Right.
it's kind of providing a way of igniting that thing that,
Mm.
that quality that is in potential in a person, and also allowing it to grow and encouraging its growth so that the child that you're talking with was like, oh, maybe that's recognized as kind. I can be kind and I can do more things that are kind. So I feel like that would be the most critical piece, I think, is to sort of start to give people a sense of this inner identity that has all these qualities, um, that then would provide a buffer for when they meet somebody
Mm.
later that tells them that they're anything other than that. They have a sense of who they are. Because what
Mm.
I think is happening now, is that parents are not providing this foundational sense of who you are and what your inner being is like. And so anything that comes from outside can just sort of take root, in
Right.
a strong way because there isn't already an understanding and a definition of the self at an early.
Mm.
Does that answer your question?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, yes, just to recap, you're emphasizing the importance of focusing on the attributes of
Mhm.
what
Mhm.
would be maybe the spiritual nature or the soul,
Yeah.
or whatever
Yeah.
you want to call that,
Yeah. Yeah.
and to focus on those virtues like
Mhm.
kindness, generosity. So the more that we can use that language with our kids, as
Mhm.
opposed to using labels and
Mhm.
judgment,
Mhm.
oh, you're so smart.
Yeah.
So saying things like, oh, that was, you really worked hard, that was,
Mhm.
you're
Mhm.
hardworking, or you're
Mhm. Mhm.
um um in other words, yeah, like yeah, generosity or kindness or loving or helpfulness, and that can build the person's inner identity. So
Yeah.
when you
Yeah.
have things coming from the outside, you have something to remind you, someone like calling you fat or
Yeah.
ugly or stupid,
Yeah.
that wouldn't crush you because you have something else to hold on to.
Yes, for sure. And we know through child development that there's a window of opportunity with that, right? Like because we now know, and this varies, but we now know that from zero, from birth to about 6 or so, a child's brain works as an undiscriminating sponge.
Mm.
So it just takes in what it sees in the world as this is the way it is, right? And then it later
Right.
develops the capacity to become a discriminating sponge
Mm.
to kind of
Right.
use a way of understanding what happens. And then when it encounters information, that information after the brain kind of gets to this point of development gets filtered through, well, what do I actually know about life, right?
Right.
So the information that a child absorbs after the brain has gone into this sort of discriminating sponge mode is
Yeah.
very different. So if you have provided for all of the infancy and the young years, that 0 to 5, 0 to 6 window of child development, if you've provided a language of self definition, that becomes a frame of reference. So I think parents don't understand just how powerful we are in shaping identity and shaping self understanding, um,
Yeah.
with this vocabulary. And the reason I say that, attributes are a really powerful way to start, right? So all of the things that are good about us, is that, I consider it spiritual growth, but there are many people, like, spirituality is a word that people are not comfortable with necessarily, or people are like, I don't even know how to do that. I'm not spiritual. I don't, I didn't grow up with religion, or um, and so in order to open a conversation and to allow parents from all backgrounds and all points of view to really participate in the building of an inner structure that will fortify their children, right? Just
Mm.
starting with attributes. Now, if you have grown up in a faith tradition, you will understand that those attributes are the things that come out of the New Testament, or the Quran, or the Bhagavad Gita. Like, all these attributes are part of our spiritual
Yeah.
heritage as humanity, right? Um, but if that's not where you come from, and you're just questioning the whole idea, then being comfortable with acknowledging the kindness of your child,
Yeah.
um, and the generosity of child also does the same. It builds that inner structure in a way,
Yeah.
um, and so I feel like that is sort of the common denominator for parents of all backgrounds and all points of view, all religious backgrounds, to be able to just begin that process of building a stronger structure within their children.
Yeah, no, I love that. I love that, because it's actually focusing on the values is something that I do, with the
Mhm,
parents whenever we work. It's the heart. I do have a framework that I came up with a few years ago, and at the heart of it is values.
mhm,
But that's like values for the family, for the parent, and what
yeah,
you're talking about is focusing on the values in the children.
mhm,
You did mention the Virtuous Project, which I
mhm,
love that you mentioned that because I think you've introduced that to me when I was a young mother,
um,
and I remember I ended up ordering those virtual cards, which were so helpful in my
mhm,
parenting because it
mhm,
always felt. Um, that it was something I can talk about with the kids, and it's not like me telling them to be something. It's like,
mhm.
hey, let's learn about this.
Yeah.
Let's learn about what kindness is,
Mhm,
because
mhm,
for those who don't know, the Virtue Project isn't like I'm not sure if it's an organization, but it's a project that was started to um, teach, to bring a language to talk about those virtues and values.
mhm,
And with kids, it's really effective because they have these cards that have, each card has a virtue, and you
mhm,
can read about sayings or how to apply that virtue in
mhm,
your life and different ways. I haven't read them in a while, but I remember when my kids were young, especially my son, like we would read them, and it would just be like this other thing that I wasn't imposing things on him. He was like
yeah,
reading it and learning about it, but it was something that we as a family we would feel like, let's work on these values in ourselves. How can we be more kind this week? How can we
yeah,
show more generosity? How can we do these things, which like later on in my parenting, now when I teach, I read, like, there's so many different books that talk about communications, and there's a
mhm,
lot of focus on not using judgment, not using
mhm,
labels.
mhm,
And so this provides you with another language. So instead of the judgment or the labels or the cultural things we learn, this gives you like another language to use with your kids.
yeah, yeah, yeah. It's very important. This is one of the things that I share a lot with clients as I work together. As we move towards diminishing the behaviors that we're not interested in having, right? That
Yeah.
need to go. It's important to have a sense of what it is that we do want, right?
Mm.
So, even the thought about parenting, you can look at it in terms of, I'm not going to do this, I'm not going to do this, I'm not going to do this. But I feel like with the Virtues Project materials, it's very much, this is what we can do, you
Right.
know. So,
Yeah. Yeah.
and and so it's a nice counterbalance to the negative view on all the things that are not possible, or not recommended. And one of my favorite memories of being a mom was, what we'd call like our virtues log in the evening. So each child, I have two children, they're grown, but each child had this really pretty notebook with a beautiful cover. And, every evening we would spend time talking about what virtues they showed,
Mm.
and I would, before they could write, I would write. So it's like, oh, today I was kind to my brother because I shared my marbles, or I helped the teacher give out, something that was helpful. And so we just have this like running log of
Mm,
virtues, noticing how we're using them, and then just awareness that, you want to be doing something every day. Um, and that's not just work for children. Like I feel like I have to be aware of that myself
yeah.
as an adult, just increasing that capacity to come from these qualities that I feel are what make us noble. That
Mm,
each of us have in potential these qualities in us of, justice and courage and kindness and love and determination and caring and compassion. And that, so I think of these qualities as a part of who we are, and that our purpose here is to bring them out in a
mm,
way, to manifest them, to help them grow, sort of the same way that you build muscle, doing bicep curls in your arms, like becoming more kind, becoming more truthful, becoming more loving. And I feel like, the title Noble Soul in my book, that nobility is really about the fact that we have all these qualities in potential to bring out,
mm.
and that's what makes us noble.
Yeah, that's really beautiful because, like even for people like me who are expats or I grew up as a third culture kid,
Mhm,
identity is a big thing. I've
mhm,
always felt like I've struggled with who I am and where I belong or all of that stuff. And I know my kids are going to struggle with that at some point. So reading this book, it's kind of reminded me, even though I'm familiar with this, but I never really thought of it in this way to when you talk about helping your clients, get through the difficult things by remembering their identity and who they are. And it really helped me to even for myself to refocus my thoughts and remember, oh, what are my qualities and who I am is
mhm,
not just where I'm from. It is not just my gender. It is not just my role as a mother
mhm,
or coach
mhm.
or sister or daughter. It's remembering those qualities. So that
Yeah.
was a great reminder. Or I
I bring this out in the book too. This idea of the difference between what I call primary identity and secondary
right,
identity.
right.
And so the way that I introduce it in the book is, when I think about myself as a woman, right? Like, what does that mean? And I conjure this idea that, I'm sort of a being in a spaceship waiting to come down, and I'm going to come to experience life on Earth. And so some computer generates the coordinates and all of the particulars about where I'm going to be. So mine was, Kenyan woman, born in Nairobi, educated parents, all of these things. Um, and then I, as a being, come into that existence, right? So the secondary identity are all of those um,
Mm,
factors about where I landed, right?
right.
But my primary identity is the fact that I'm this indescribable, precious soul or spirit or
Mm,
essence, right? And so when we think about ourselves as having a primary identity and then all the other identities that we come to, get when we land as our secondary identities, then it's easy to sort of have a sense of, okay, how do I navigate life? Because at the level of primary identity, that's what I'm here to develop. And this is my particular experience, right? And you came with a particular experience, but at the level of primary identity, we're actually the same.
right. Wow. Yeah, that was a really beautiful example. I remember that. I love that part in the book. And
So
I
I
think,
feel I feel
yeah.
like the job of a parent is to, in those early years, really strengthen that
Mm,
sense of primary identity, right?
mm,
While
right,
also maintaining awareness of these secondary identities. They're not unimportant. They shape experience, they bring diversity to the human experience. But knowing the difference between primary and secondary identity and how
right,
they work together, um,
right.
is also a very fortifying piece, It's like
Yeah.
you're talking about your children, and I can remember there are many times that people would ask my kids where they're from, and having lived everywhere, you can see in their faces they don't quite know how to answer this question.
Yeah.
And so I think it's important for for children who live this international life, but for everybody to really have a sense of themselves as having a primary identity,
Right, right. No, that is really true
as
for
as a spiritual identity.
right. So yeah, for third culture kids and expat kids, I think this is very important because a lot of them this is big. And so I mean, now that you say that, I feel like, yes, so focusing on these qualities and values, and I feel like it's also the way we speak to them. If we focus so much just on the behavior and the things that we don't want, or
Mhm. Mhm.
like sometimes, especially when your kids are little, parents get really um, hung up, maybe like, I don't want my kid to be bad, or I don't want my kid to be a bully, or I don't want my kid to
Mhm.
be, do these bad things. So sometimes we just focus on the behavior that we don't want, that we forget to focus to nurture that other identity that we want in our
Yeah.
kids.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Something that's sort of very it's a sort of primary behavioral concept within the therapy world, but I think it's out broadly is this idea that what you notice increases.
Right.
And
Yes.
as a parent, what do you pay attention to, right?
Yeah.
And so you can catch a child doing the wrong thing or what you would prefer they didn't do, and you can focus there, or you can wait to see the behaviors that you want to increase and encourage those, and then
Yeah.
that way you
Right.
extinguish certain behaviors and reinforce others. So I
Right.
think something to think about as a parent is like what you notice increases. So
Yeah. Yeah.
and children want attention. They need attention, and they will take any attention you're willing to give. So you, as the adult, get to choose what the attention is going to be.
That's true. Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely. That's very true. There's another part of the book I wanted to make sure that I mention here,
Mhm.
where you talk about accepting our whole selves,
Mhm.
accepting our emotions. And I love this because talking about emotions with parenting classes and workshops, it's just such a big thing and an important thing, especially accepting. I love that you mentioned that, accepting all emotions and all feelings. And I know, like, for some parents who grew up in traditional cultures, like sometimes in the Middle East, I've had a dad, not a dad actually, he was a young man who was telling me that men struggle here with, accepting their softer kind of feelings,
Mhm.
not,
Mhm.
you're expected to behave in such a way as a man. And I think also for girls, sometimes we don't accept their aggressiveness or their anger or their, other kind of emotions. And so the kids, we grow up feeling like we have to depress or hide one part of us as opposed to
Mhm.
accepting our
Mhm.
whole self. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that.
So, yeah, the way I think about it, and this is something that I think, gosh, if I had been empowered in this way as a young child, so it would have been so helpful. Um,
Yeah.
is this idea that we have both a higher and a lower nature is how I
Mm,
think about it. Um, and so there's this part of us that has this aspiration for good and the qualities and the attributes that we've been talking about. But there's also a part of us that would, do the opposite, like, has a
yeah.
tendency to anger and greed and impatience and all of those things. And so understanding the duality of human nature and accepting it as such is, I think, a very powerful piece to moving forward. So as a parent, normalizing that struggle for
Mm,
children between the
mm,
higher and the lower self is a very powerful educational piece that then allows a child to see themselves as um, in charge of how those dynamics will go. Right? One of the metaphors I use for that is the rider and the horse in the book, right? So
yeah.
you think of the lower nature as the sort of wild horse and the rider as the higher nature. And so the higher nature has the ability to train the lower nature and to entertain the horse in a way and to have things go. But rejecting that lower nature or being particularly troubled by it or feeling like you're a terrible person because you have a lower nature is counterproductive, right? Because
Mm,
everybody has that inner struggle, right? Your
yeah.
struggle may be a little different from mine. You may have challenges with one aspect of your lower self whereas I have with other, but just
Mm,
understanding that everybody has that struggle helps a
right.
lot. I mean, certainly with the clients that come in, they're like, oh my gosh, this happened, I got so angry, and then they immediately got from I'm so angry to I'm a terrible person, right?
Yeah.
And so I was like,
Yeah.
no, no, no.
Right.
It's we get angry. People get angry. We have a side of us that is sort of the shadow side in a way, but everybody has that, right? And the
Right.
process of life is actually learning to subdue that and manifest more the higher self,
Mm.
but also not feeling shame or guilt or inadequate because of
Yeah.
the struggle.
Mm.
Does that answer your
Oh yeah,
question?
absolutely. I mean, that is so true. I feel like on many different levels,
Yeah.
there's all the spectrum of emotions, and
Mhm.
then there is, the higher and the lower nature as you describe
Mhm.
it. Like sometimes, we might have feelings of jealousy or
Yes.
greed or
Mhm.
and
Mhm.
if we grew up in a place where I don't know, we're taught to be so righteous all the
Mhm.
time that when we have these feelings, we might, yeah, like you said, we might feel shame and then
Mhm.
might, either depress, like try
Mhm.
to hide these emotions, which might end up in depression
Yeah.
or anxiety, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I
Work.
yeah, I really appreciated this because I feel like that is something I've struggled with
Mhm.
personally,
Mhm.
accepting that, like having to live up to a standard,
Mhm.
the good
Mhm.
girl, for
Uh-huh.
example.
Yeah. Yeah.
And yeah, it took me years to really accept all these different parts.
Yeah.
So yeah, with raising our kids, um, yeah, I think that's really important.
Mhm.
It does require a lot of patience, I think, from the parent side or letting go from their fears, because I feel
Mm.
like there is that fear if I accept or normalize that for my child, they might not be that example or that, they might drift in the wrong way, for example.
Yeah. 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 For sure. I think becoming comfortable enough with our own higher and lower manifestations, like higher and
Mm,
lower self, and allowing our children to see us and to
mm,
speak to our own struggle opens the door for them to realize, oh, mom also struggles with this, and I'm
mm.
not talking about unburdening and, putting out information that young children shouldn't necessarily have, but, a parent, like a child can see me being impatient and then I can just say, gosh, that was really impatient. I struggle with that, but I'm working on becoming more patient and just normalizing that
Yeah.
and them seeing that you also are navigating the same journey that they have to navigate, right?
Mm,
Is very empowering. So it's that, as parents, we don't have to have figured it out and be perfect, right?
yeah.
It's actually our efforts to
Mm,
grow that inform our children's efforts to grow, you
right.
know? It's not the outcome from our part in terms of this is where I am. It's like them seeing you make the effort and then like, oh, mom makes this effort this way, and I need to make the effort this way. Or dad makes the effort this way, I need to make the effort this way. Then they start to see us as human too, figuring it out. And
Yeah.
that's an empowering place for children to be. Certainly, at least in my experience looking at my client population, beautiful, beautiful people that sometimes just be like, oh, this is happening and it must mean I'm terrible, and then shame.
Yeah. Yeah. That drift into shame is just so
Yeah,
quick and
yeah.
it's so hard.
Yes, yes, yeah. But
Yeah.
we're all here on a journey together.
Yeah. Yeah. So remembering our true identity, who we are, our values and our attributes,
Yeah,
and trying to nurture that with our
yeah,
kids.
yeah, yeah.
And
So
yeah.
I would say, like, if I were to think about, okay, what would be the top three things as a parent that you could start with, um, in terms of building this sense of inner understanding for your children, for themselves,
Mm,
and for yourself, is really this understanding that these attributes, that the love, the kindness, are really qualities of the inner essence, right? Because
mm,
sometimes we interface with them as skills that you can learn, right? But
mm,
that's very different. Like, learning how to play guitar is very different from bringing out kindness that's already in you, right? And
mm,
recognizing that you're already a courageous person. So, sort of framing these qualities as qualities of the inner essence, I think would be the first. Like, so working with the attributes from that perspective.
mm,
The other, I think, that could be particularly helpful as parenting, in parenting, is the idea that everybody has a higher and a lower self. And
Mm,
our journey here is to just manifest more of a higher self and tame the lower self, right? Not
yeah.
get rid of it. And to see that our victories as individuals really come from that dynamic between higher and lower self, right? Because there can't be growth if there isn't an alternative in a way.
Mm,
And then to just go into a new space, I think one of the things that would be particularly helpful, and I say these from the population I treat, and is the idea that life is supposed to be challenging, right?
mm,
And that's a very different take from people expecting life to be easy, and then anytime they meet a roadblock feeling like, oh, I got it wrong. So I think that those
right.
three spaces is to sort of teach children and to normalize hardship, in that challenges are here for us to grow. We're here to grow our attributes don't grow without contrast, without the opposite potentially happening. So life is going to throw challenges at you, and you always have the capacity to overcome them. So I would say those would be the main areas that would be sort of the beginning blocks of building this sort of stronger inner structures that can resist, like where we started, can resist some of the bullying that takes place by the time you get to elementary school, and
Right.
all the messages society is going to be throwing at you.
Yeah. 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 That I love this. So the three things is start with nurturing those attributes
Hmm.
and the values in the children to have them to have that strong inner identity.
Hmm.
And then the second one was to normalize the higher self and the lower self
Hmm. Hmm.
that were so I mean when I think about that one I feel like that is where normalizing helpful because when you cannot control or influence something that you don't have language for. So if you
Hmm.
don't bring it up and talk about it, it's hard
Yeah.
to be able to control it or tame it
Mhm.
or
Mhm. Mhm.
whatever. And then the third one is to what was it?
Is to just understand that life is going to be
Yes.
challenging, right?
Yes, that challenge.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Hardships. Yeah, we're not supposed to, life is not supposed, and it's not
Yeah.
easy for anybody.
Yeah.
And I feel like I can think of, for example, of a parent of a smaller children.
Mm.
I feel like the parents themselves have to
Mhm.
grow these attributes and values into themselves because dealing with the toddler years is so challenging that you have to have that patience and that kindness and graciousness dealing with children.
Yeah.
Um, throwing tantrums or refusing to do stuff. So sometimes you have to remind yourself with your own values because like sometimes when I hear the struggles of young parents, I can see the frustrations. They're like,
Mhm.
how they describe their kids as monsters or
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
oppositional or whatever. So I think for the parents, growing those attributes and values and remembering to just have graciousness, I guess,
Yeah. Yeah.
grace
Yeah.
in parenting.
Yeah. I have on working over time with clients and sort of seeing what works, what doesn't work. I've come up with this tool that I call it's a little booklet called Discovering Your Inner Essence. And
Mm,
so that's available as just the beginning to sort of understand your attributes. And then you can
mm,
also use it with your children. So that's available on my website. If you subscribe to my newsletter, kadzokangwana.com, it's available for you and any people who might be interested to just download this little booklet. It's actually the same protocol that I go through with clients in my office. And people have called it, like that thing that you did, that was life changing. So I just want to offer that. If someone's going to leave this conversation thinking, how do I do this attributes
yeah.
thing? That's a starting place.
That was going to be like my next question, like how can people learn more or so yes, I will put that website in the description under the
Mhm.
podcast or if you're watching this on YouTube. So the website is
Kadzokangwana.com.
Katzo Kangwana. I'll put that. And the tool is called, what is it called?
Discovering the gifts of your essence.
Oh, that is perfect. Yeah, because you do need like you want to start somewhere and it's
Yeah.
really helpful to have a tool that helps you start somewhere for yourself and
Yeah.
then you can do it with your children.
Yeah. Yeah. And
Yeah.
this is it's a simple concept, but it is very profound in terms of, starting to see yourself as having these qualities, seeing your children as having these qualities. I
Mm,
still remember the moment that I felt recognized for some of my inequalities, and it was just having that mirror was very, very powerful. So
Oh, wow.
yeah,
Wow. That's yeah, that is such a gift.
yeah.
Um, I want to thank you so much, Katzo, for being here with me. I don't want to take more of your time. I feel like this is like such an important conversation, and like it's your wisdom has inspired me in my own parenting, because I remember hearing these some of these ideas when my son was young, so it really started me on the right path. I always wondered, like, gosh, if I didn't meet Katzo, I don't know, I don't know if I'll be doing this work, because these conversations inspired me to like really dig deeper at parenting, to
Yeah.
really try to understand the work of parenting and what goes into raising a child, and to see that there is just a different perspective than just focusing on discipline or focusing on
Mm,
behavior and
mm,
getting caught up in all of that, that there is another path, and coupling that with building connection and relationship with your child. I think this is really helps
mm. Thank you
that
so
process.
much.
Yeah, so
Thank you so much.
thank you so much. Is there anything else you would like to leave the parents with? um
I,
any
I
final words?
just really encourage this exploration of who we are at the depth of our core. There's so much data now coming out saying that, children who have a strong spiritual life or sense of spirituality are
Mm,
protected from depression as teenagers, from substance use and abuse, and there's statistics around that. So, uh,
mm.
thinking about how to bring that into your family. If it's a language you're already comfortable with, great. If it's something you need to learn, definitely, sort of, there are resources out there to support you on that journey. And
Yeah, that is actually that is so important. You mentioned the spiritual connection. I just had a conversation, I think two weeks ago, with a someone who facilitates nonviolent communication workshops, and she mentioned that the importance of the spiritual connection between parents and child.
yeah,
So I think there's a lot more awareness, and a lot of people are looking for that deeper meaning
yeah.
to our life.
And
So
I also, my book has the tools that I use with clients are also like really adaptable sort of to parents. So, this is written as a book for women, but there are tools in there that can be applied to the
yeah,
parents you have mentioned. So that's available anywhere that you buy books.
yeah, I would encourage every person to get a copy of this book and read it. It's honestly, it's been like life changing the past few weeks that I've been reading it.
um,
It's such a good book. So many sections of it. I feel like I feel like we need a book club just to really go deeper into these.
I would
So
love
maybe
that.
one day, maybe you will be able to facilitate
That
facilitate
would be
something
great.
like
Yeah,
that.
no, I'd be happy to. It's an offering that learning from my clients I wanted to put out there so that it could reach more people.
Mm,
This connection between that who we are at the deepest level and our mental health is a powerful connection, and I think as parents we can
yeah,
really do a lot around that in the early years of parenting. So
absolutely.
I encourage people, and if you want to email me, my email's on my website. Happy to
I was
connect.
going to ask you, do you work with people like online, or how does it work? Do
I
you do
do. I mean,
coaching maybe? I know with
I
therapy, like you have to be in the same area or something. I'm not sure.
I mean, like I do work with clients. I treat trauma. Something I didn't talk about is I use a method called rapid resolution therapy, which is a short term intervention. So I see clients from 3 to 5 times to resolve a particular issue. But you can always find someone who does rapid resolution therapy near you if you're in the United States, and then I think there's a large group of people who are comfortable to work online with people internationally. So
Right.
definitely rapidresolutiontherapy.com is a nice resource.
Mm,
And then in my own website too.
okay. Well,
Yeah.
yeah, I'll definitely put your website, and I would encourage people to get the book and read it, and reach out to Katzo if you have any questions. Download that tool. And yeah, I hope this conversation inspires you in any way and brings maybe more joy and peace to your parenting.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Mia.
Thank you, Katzo, for being here. It's been a pleasure.
It's
All
been
right. Take care. Bye.